I was fired by a stupid boss who didn't know that I had a patent for the system and wanted to steal all my glory for himself. It all started when Altura Tech announced that we were getting a new CEO. His name was Benjamin Carter, but he insisted that everyone call him Ben, like he was trying to create this casual, approachable vibe that did not fool anyone. Ben had the look of every corporate messiah you have ever seen. Perfectly tailored gray suit, hair that looked like it was sculpted with a ruler, and a Rolex that gleamed under the overhead lights every time he made one of his grand hand gestures. He swept into the company like a whirlwind, holding town hall meetings that felt more like pep rallies, and sent out email after email about the new era of speed and innovation at Altura. The first thing he did, literally within his first hour on the job, was gather the leadership team into the main conference room and slap his palm against the table as he declared, "Speed is everything from now on." You could have heard a pin drop in there. I looked around and caught the eye of Sam, one of our senior network engineers, and we shared a silent moment of complete disbelief. Speed is everything? That might sound good in a flashy presentation, but Altura's infrastructure was a nightmare spaghetti of legacy systems, half-finished migrations, and duct-taped solutions holding entire departments together. We were not a Formula One car waiting to be unleashed. We were more like an old cargo ship barely holding course in rough waters. It became painfully clear in that first week that Ben had absolutely no idea how anything at Altura actually worked. He would talk about optimizing workflows and accelerating delivery, like he was throwing darts at a board full of corporate buzzwords. But when you asked him a simple question about our systems, he would blink at you like you had started speaking in ancient Greek. In one particularly painful meeting, someone asked him how he planned to align his speed at all costs mantra with our highly regulated client data processes, and he waved it off with a laugh and said, "You guys will figure it out. That's what I pay you for." The worst part was that upper management, desperate for any sign of change after a few rough financial quarters, fell for his act completely. They started parroting his phrases in meetings. Suddenly everything was about agility and momentum, even when it made no sense. We had entire project plans scrapped overnight because Ben decided we were moving too slowly. He pushed for aggressive deadlines without understanding that our core servers were running on systems old enough to legally drink. When a few of us tried to raise concerns, we were brushed aside as naysayers who did not get the vision. I remember one particularly surreal moment about a month into his reign. We had a critical failure in one of our main data centers because someone had rushed a migration under his new Speed First initiative. We spent 72 hours straight trying to patch the fallout, while Ben strolled through the tech floor handing out energy drinks like he was some kind of wartime general handing out rations. When the crisis was finally under control, he posted a company-wide message congratulating us for proving that rapid adaptation is possible when we believe in ourselves. Not a single word about the preventable disaster that his policies had caused. I would like to say it got better, but honestly, that was just the beginning. I had been at Altura Tech for over 10 years by the time Ben Carter showed up in his immaculate gray suit and made his grand speech about speed being everything. My name is Olivia Hayes, and honestly, by that point, I thought I had seen it all. I had survived 3 different CEOs before him, each one with their own shiny new promises, their dramatic reorganizations, and of course, the inevitable layoffs that followed when those promises crumbled into nothing. There had been quarters when the office felt like a ghost town after the pink slips went out, and reorganizations so chaotic you needed a map just to figure out who your manager was that week. Through all of it, I stayed. Some called it loyalty, others said it was stubbornness, but for me, it was simple. I liked the work, and more importantly, I believed in what we were building, even when leadership clearly had no idea how to actually build it. My biggest contribution, the one thing I was genuinely proud of, happened right after the failed merger back in 2017. That merger was a disaster from start to finish. 2 companies with completely incompatible systems, a rushed timeline, and leadership too busy measuring their new office views to care about the mess happening under their feet. In the middle of that chaos, it became obvious that our server architecture was hopelessly outmatched by the demands being placed on it. Systems were buckling under the strain, outages were becoming routine, and clients were getting angrier by the hour. Most of the leadership at the time responded by sending increasingly panicked emails or calling useless emergency meetings. Meanwhile, a handful of us down in the trenches actually started fixing the damn thing. I led a small team to design a new server architecture from the ground up. We were pulling 15-hour days for weeks, scavenging hardware from abandoned offices, bargaining with vendors for expedited shipments, and writing code like our lives depended on it. There were nights I slept on a beanbag in the server room because it made more sense than wasting 2 hours commuting back and forth. I still remember the day we cut over to the new architecture. It was about 2:30 in the morning. Everything went dark for a few terrifying seconds, and then the system sprang back to life, faster and more stable than it had ever been. I just sat there staring at the monitor for a few minutes before it really hit me that we had pulled it off. That server architecture not only saved the company's skin, but ended up being the backbone of everything we did for the next several years. It was not flashy. It did not make the front page of any tech magazines. But it worked. It kept our clients happy and gave us the breathing room to recover from the merger disaster. People who really knew what had happened behind the scenes, always treated me with a little more respect after that. Not that it mattered much to leadership. They sent a nice email, gave me a plaque at the holiday party, and moved on. So when Ben Carter came in with his perfect hair and his big talk about speed, I knew exactly what was about to happen. He was going to ignore the reality of our infrastructure, make a lot of reckless demands, and then blame us when everything inevitably blew up in his face. I had been here long enough to know that stability never lasted forever. At Altura, stability was always just the quiet before the next storm. And standing there listening to Ben talk, I could already feel the first cold gusts of wind starting to blow. The real problems started when Ben decided that our regular technical meetings were a waste of time. He sent out a chipper email one morning announcing that he was canceling all scheduled engineering syncs and replacing them with what he called vision brainstorms. According to him, we needed to spend less time getting lost in technical weeds and more time thinking big, disruptive thoughts. That might sound inspiring if you were new and had no idea what our day-to-day looked like. But for those of us who kept the company running, it was the equivalent of telling a surgeon to stop worrying about sterilizing their instruments because the real priority was to imagine bolder surgeries. At first, I tried to play along. I sat through those ridiculous brainstorm sessions, scribbling down buzzwords like future-proof, moonshot thinking, and creative disruption, while the actual technical debt piled up like a landfill. There were no action items, no architecture reviews, no critical bug prioritizations. Just endless whiteboards filled with meaningless diagrams that looked like they had been drawn by someone who had never written a line of code in their life. Then it got worse. Ben, in his infinite wisdom, decided he needed to be more hands-on with product development. Without any preparation, without even telling my team beforehand, he started poking around in our code base. I will never forget logging into our system one morning and seeing a commit from Ben Carter himself. No pull request, no review process, just straight into production. I opened the file with this sinking feeling in my gut and saw that he had made changes to one of the critical service modules I had personally designed and maintained for the last 5 years. The code was a disaster. It looked like he had just Googled some snippets and mashed them together without understanding what any of it did. He broke basic syntax rules, introduced glaring security vulnerabilities, and somehow managed to degrade the system's performance by about 30% in a single afternoon. When I confronted him about it, trying to keep my voice calm even though I was practically vibrating with anger, he laughed it off. He actually said, "Come on, Olivia, it's just code. How bad could it be?" The next week, Ben pulled some of the junior engineers into a series of mandatory innovation workshops where he forced them to experiment with our flagship product. I'm not talking about setting up a sandbox environment or working on a cloned dev branch. He had them pushing live updates to components that accounted for 87% of our total company revenue. These kids were barely out of college, brilliant but inexperienced, and now they were terrified because they knew they were being ordered to play Frankenstein with the single most important product we had. When a few of them hesitated or tried to ask questions about rollback plans or testing protocols, Ben brushed them off, telling them they needed to stop being so risk-averse and embrace failure as a teacher. I sat in the back of one of those sessions, watching it unfold, and I realized that we were heading straight for a cliff and Ben was stomping on the gas pedal with a big stupid grin on his face. It did not matter that I had built the backbone of this company's infrastructure. It did not matter that half of the senior engineers were waving red flags so hard we could have hosted a parade. Ben had the full backing of the board, and in his mind, that meant he was untouchable. So we did what we could. We pulled emergency backups. We wrote frantic patches in the dead of night. We created shadow copies of critical systems without telling him, just in case his experiments set the whole thing on fire. But we all knew it was only a matter of time before something exploded that even we could not quietly fix behind the scenes. And every day, it felt like that moment was getting closer. What Ben Carter did not know, and what none of the new leadership had bothered to read carefully, was that I actually owned the patent for the server architecture that kept Altura Tech afloat. It was not some minor technical footnote either. After the disaster of the 2017 merger, when I led the redevelopment of the entire system under conditions that could only be described as barely controlled chaos. I had taken the step of patenting the architecture under my name. I was not being sneaky about it. It was all done completely above board, with the company's full knowledge at the time. It was even clearly stated in my employment contract that while Altura had an exclusive license to use the system, actual ownership of the intellectual property remained with me unless renegotiated in writing. Back then, the executives were just desperate to keep the lights on. They did not care who owned what, as long as the system worked and the client stayed happy. In fact, they were the ones who had insisted that we document everything, including the licensing terms, to avoid any future confusion. It was a buried clause in a stack of papers nobody in upper management had probably read all the way through since. But I had. I had read every single line, every single provision, and I had made damn sure that my work, the work that had saved the company, would not be stolen from me down the line. Ben, for all his talk about vision and innovation, never once thought to ask who actually controlled the foundation of the company's technical infrastructure. He operated under the arrogant assumption that everything inside Altura's walls belonged to Altura, that he could make whatever changes he wanted without consequence. I kept my mouth shut and my head down while he recklessly poked and prodded at systems he barely understood, silently waiting for the moment when he would push too far. The truth was simple and powerful. Without my written consent, Altura Tech had no legal right to modify, replicate, or deploy my server architecture in any way that deviated from the original specifications. Any major alterations, any attempt to commercialize derivative systems, or even substantial structural updates without my approval could expose them to a lawsuit that would make the entire board break out into cold sweats. I had spent years building that architecture, and in doing so, I had built a quiet safety net for myself. If they wanted to destroy the system out of sheer incompetence, that was their business. But if they thought they could bulldoze over my work and then pretend it was all theirs, they were in for a very rude awakening. I had the trump card tucked away, and sooner or later, Ben was going to realize that the thing he thought he controlled was never really his to begin with. The first real hint that things were starting to turn ugly came when Ben stopped referring to me by my actual title. I had been Chief Systems Architect at Altura Tech for years, a role that carried a lot of weight both internally and with our clients, especially those who understood just how critical our infrastructure was to the company's survival. But somewhere along the way, without any official announcement or even the courtesy of a private conversation, Ben began introducing me to others simply as the lead developer. At first, I thought it was a slip of the tongue, maybe just another one of his many careless mistakes. But it kept happening. In meetings with department heads, in emails to the board, even in front of newer employees who would not have known any better, he consistently downgraded my title like it was nothing more than a minor semantic adjustment. I knew exactly what he was doing. By casually stripping away the authority my real title carried, he was trying to minimize my influence, make it easier for him to bulldoze over anything I might say without raising suspicion. It became even more obvious during our so-called strategy meetings. Whenever I spoke up, usually to point out a glaring technical risk in one of his grand new initiatives, he would either ignore me completely or steamroll past my comments with a half-hearted, "We'll circle back to that we all knew would never happen." Meanwhile, if I said something that actually aligned with one of his pet ideas or could be twisted to sound like it supported his reckless agenda, he would immediately reframe it as his own insight. There was one meeting I still remember vividly, when I laid out a potential restructuring plan for our data center network that could have dramatically improved efficiency without risking uptime. I had spent 2 weeks putting it together, crunching numbers, modeling failure scenarios, and crafting a proposal that balanced innovation with the brutal realities of our infrastructure. I presented it to the room, carefully walking through the logic and the risks. Ben sat there nodding like he was half listening, offering no real feedback. The next day, I sat in on an executive briefing where Ben practically word for word repeated my entire proposal, presenting it like it had been his idea all along. He even peppered it with little offhand comments about thinking outside the box and challenging traditional assumptions, making it seem like he was single-handedly leading some brilliant technical revolution. He did not mention me once. He did not even glance in my direction as he took credit for the work I had spent weeks perfecting. I knew better than to call him out publicly, not because I was afraid of him, but because the people he was trying to impress were already eating out of the palm of his hand. To them, Ben was the golden boy, the visionary leader who was going to drag Altura Tech into the future whether we were ready or not. Pointing out the truth would only make me look like I was being petty or defensive, and Ben knew that. It was a calculated move, just like downgrading my title, just like ignoring my warnings. At that point, it was not even about ego. I could have lived with someone else getting the applause if it meant the work was being done right. But it was clear that Ben was not just a fool. He was a fool with an agenda, and people like that are far more dangerous than simple incompetence. He was dismantling the foundations of the company piece by piece, and he did not even realize he was standing on one of those very foundations while swinging the sledgehammer. It happened on a Friday, because of course it did. That was the corporate playbook move, after all. Wait until the end of the week when everything is winding down, when people are already mentally checked out and there is less chance of a public scene. Ben Carter strolled into my office without knocking, wearing that polished fake smile he always pulled out when he thought he was being charming, the one that never reached his eyes. I was in the middle of documenting some final system updates, a habit I had kept up even as the walls around me were starting to crack, when he leaned casually against the doorway like he owned the place. "Olivia," he said in that nauseatingly upbeat tone, "we are making some exciting changes. We are optimizing the team for greater efficiency and agility." Then he dropped the hammer, like it was nothing more than a casual afterthought. "You are fired, effective immediately." I just sat there for a second, letting his words hang in the air. I could see he was waiting for some kind of reaction, maybe anger, maybe begging, maybe even some dramatic blow-up he could use to paint me as the problem later on. But he got nothing. I stood up calmly, walked around my desk, and extended my hand to him. He looked slightly thrown off, but covered it quickly, grabbing my hand in a quick, firm shake like he had already mentally moved on to his next meeting. I did not say a word. I did not give him the satisfaction of asking why, or arguing, or pleading my case. I simply nodded once, turned on my heel, and walked out. No dramatic exit, no slamming doors, no last-minute warnings. I left behind my company laptop, my access badge, and any illusion that Altura Tech still had a future under Ben Carter's leadership. What he did not realize, what no one in that leadership circle realized, was that firing me without securing new legal rights to the server architecture was the corporate equivalent of setting a time bomb and then handing me the detonator. Without my consent, they were operating on a system they had no legal right to maintain, modify, or commercialize. Monday morning was not going to be the triumphant new beginning Ben had promised the board. It was going to be a waking nightmare, and the best part was, I did not even have to lift a finger to make it happen. They had done it all to themselves. On Saturday morning, while the rest of the city was sleeping in or heading to brunch, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and started drafting the legal notice. I pulled out the original contract I had signed with Altura Tech all those years ago, the one that clearly stated that the company had a limited, revocable license to use my server architecture, contingent on the terms of my employment and written consent for any modifications. With my termination now official and no renegotiated agreement in place, I had every right to terminate that license immediately. I wrote the letter carefully, methodically, citing every relevant clause and legal precedent that backed me up. There was no anger in it, no gloating, just cold, professional language that would make it impossible for them to claim ignorance or wiggle out of the consequences. Once I finished, I had it reviewed by a lawyer I trusted, someone who had handled tech contracts for years and understood exactly what kind of leverage I had. He read it twice, looked up at me, and said, "This is bulletproof." With the legal notice ready to go first thing Monday morning, I decided to add a little extra weight to the situation. I had seen in one of the internal newsletters before my departure that Altura Tech was sponsoring a major innovation conference in the city the following week. It was a big deal for them, a chance to show off their so-called transformation under Ben's leadership, and a key opportunity to impress potential investors and clients. Without hesitating, I went online and signed up as a speaker. It was almost laughably easy. They had an open submission process for industry professionals, and my credentials as Chief Systems Architect, a title they could not erase from public record no matter how badly Ben wanted to, made me an automatic shoo-in. I submitted a talk proposal about the risks of neglecting intellectual property agreements in corporate innovation, dressed up in the kind of vague, jargon-filled language that would not immediately set off alarm bells with the organizers. By the end of the day, my spot was confirmed. I would be speaking right under their noses at an event they were sponsoring about the very disaster that was about to unfold within their own walls. It was almost too perfect. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a calm settle over me. I did not have to raise my voice, or send angry emails, or burn bridges. All I had to do was stand there, tell the truth, and let the avalanche that Ben Carter had set into motion bury him completely. Monday morning arrived with a kind of electric stillness, the kind you feel right before a storm rips through. At exactly 8 a.m., my lawyer sent the formal termination notice to Altura Tech's legal department, with copies forwarded to the board of directors, the CEO's office, and the event organizers for the innovation conference. I had no doubt it would land like a grenade in the middle of their so-called transformation plans, but I was still curious to see exactly how fast the fallout would spread. By 9:30, I was already at the conference, blending into the crowd. The event was buzzing with anticipation. Journalists were setting up their cameras. Investors were milling around with their branded tote bags and thin smiles. And the Altura Tech booth had been given a prime spot right in front of the main hall stage. There was even a massive digital screen behind the booth with the words Altura Tech, reimagining the future, glowing across it in animated letters. Their big moment was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp. Ben was going to unveil the new and improved platform, the crown jewel of his so-called vision for Altura. I positioned myself near the back of the room where I had a clear view of the stage, careful not to draw any attention. I watched as Ben and his team, all looking slightly too polished, slightly too nervous, set up their equipment. I knew exactly what they were about to walk into. The house lights dimmed, the stage lights came up, and Ben walked onto the stage with a ridiculous amount of swagger, dressed in a dark blue suit that probably cost more than most of us made in a month. He gave his usual empty spiel about agility, disruption, and the power of bold thinking. Then, with a dramatic flourish, he announced the live demo of the new platform. Cameras clicked. Investors leaned forward in their seats. Ben tapped the screen to launch the system. For a few agonizing seconds, the screen went black. Then, in bold white letters against a stark gray background, a message appeared. It was simple, direct, and impossible to miss. The license is invalid. Please contact the patent holder. There was a collective gasp, the kind of sound you usually only hear in movies when something truly catastrophic happens. At first, people thought it was a joke, some kind of edgy stunt. But as the Altura team frantically scrambled behind the podium, clicking, unplugging, restarting devices with growing panic, it became very clear that this was not part of the plan. Ben's face drained of color almost instantly. He tried to recover, tried to joke that there were technical difficulties, but the damage was already done. Journalists started whispering into their microphones, typing furiously. Investors pulled out their phones, no doubt emailing their partners and lawyers. The conference organizers, visibly furious, hovered around the stage, clearly demanding answers that no one from Altura could give. I stayed for a few more minutes, watching the chaos unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had not thrown the first stone, but had simply removed the floorboards from under the fool dancing on them. Then I made my way toward the side hall where my own session would begin shortly, my conference badge hanging neatly around my neck. The irony of it all was almost too much. While Ben and his team were busy trying to explain how they had lost control of their own infrastructure, I was about to step on stage at their own sponsored event to talk about the critical importance of respecting intellectual property and understanding the real value of the people behind innovation. I was sitting near the back of the room, watching the disaster unfold, when I decided the timing was perfect. The Altura team was still scrambling. Ben was turning a deeper shade of red with every second, and the journalists were already smelling blood in the water. I stood up slowly, letting the tension in the room build for a beat longer, and then I raised my voice so that it cut cleanly through the noise. I own the server architecture, I said, loud and clear, and Altura Tech is using it illegally without a valid license. For a moment, there was complete silence, like the entire room had been punched in the gut at the same time. Then everything exploded at once. Reporters jumped to their feet, cameras swung around and locked onto me, and a dozen different voices started shouting questions over one another. I could see phones coming up, recording, streaming, capturing every second of the moment. Some investors were openly talking into their earpieces, no doubt relaying the disaster back to their offices. Ben just stood there on stage, frozen like a deer in the headlights. He looked as if someone had taken off a shoe and hit him square in the forehead. His mouth opened once, then closed, like he was trying to think of something, anything, to say, but no words came out. The polished CEO mask he always wore so carefully had shattered completely. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had blundered into a disaster of his own making without even realizing the ground was crumbling underneath him. I stayed standing, calm and unbothered, answering a few shouted questions with short, precise statements. I made it clear that the system Altura had been presenting was built on technology they no longer had the right to use, that the legal notice had been delivered that morning, and that any further use of my intellectual property would be met with immediate legal action. By the time the conference organizers finally rushed over to try and calm the chaos, the damage was already irreversible. Every major business journalist in the room had the story of the year handed to them on a silver platter. And Ben, who had bet everything on that big public unveiling, was now the face of one of the most humiliating corporate implosions I had ever witnessed. I sat back down, crossed my legs casually, and watched the last few shreds of Ben Carter's credibility burn to ashes in real time. It was, without a doubt, the most satisfying moment of my entire career. It did not take long for the panic to spread. Within just a few hours of the conference disaster, Altura Tech stock price started to nosedive. I had pulled up a live ticker on my phone while grabbing a coffee, and I watched it happen in real time, the numbers dropping like a stone thrown into a pond. 22% wiped off their market value before lunchtime, and there was no sign of it slowing down. The real blow, though, came from the clients. Some of our biggest accounts, the ones that had been responsible for keeping Altura profitable during the rough quarters, started pulling out almost immediately. I heard from a few contacts still inside the company that by mid-morning, client relationship managers were being overwhelmed with furious calls and emails demanding explanations, and when none were satisfactory, cancellations started pouring in. Some were citing breach of contract. Others were simply refusing to continue doing business with a company that could not even guarantee legal use of its own infrastructure. By noon, my phone started ringing with numbers I recognized all too well. Altura's legal department, the same people who had likely signed off on firing me without bothering to check their own documents, were now desperately trying to get in touch. They left voicemail after voicemail, each one more frantic than the last, asking, then pleading, for me to come to the table and negotiate. I listened to the messages in silence, sitting in a quiet corner of the conference center, feeling no urgency whatsoever. They could beg all they wanted. They had made their choices. Now they could live with the consequences. That evening, while Altura Tech was still trying to put out the fires they had set themselves, I was sitting in a quiet corner booth of an upscale hotel bar downtown, meeting with Michael Reynolds, the CEO of Axiom Systems. Michael was everything Ben pretended to be, but never was: sharp, calm, and someone who actually understood the technical side of the business as well as the financial. He had reached out earlier in the day, as soon as the news about Altura's meltdown started circulating, and asked if we could meet privately to discuss mutual opportunities. We skipped the small talk and got right down to business. I explained the situation without dressing it up. I told him about the patent, the revoked license, and the full extent of Altura's legal vulnerabilities. Then I made him an offer. I would license my architecture to Axiom Systems under exclusive terms, along with a partnership agreement that would allow them to adapt and expand the system with my direct collaboration. In return, I wanted not just a financial deal, but a true strategic partnership where I would retain influence over how the technology evolved. Michael listened carefully, asking smart questions, never once showing the arrogance or condescension that had become so common at Altura under Ben's leadership. When I laid out the draft terms, he leaned back in his seat, gave me a slow, deliberate nod, and said, "I think we can build something incredible together." I left that meeting knowing that while Altura was scrambling just to survive another news cycle, I was already moving forward. The architecture I had built, the one they had taken for granted, was about to find a new home, one that actually respected it and respected me. 48 hours after that first meeting with Michael Reynolds, I found myself sitting at a polished oak table in Axiom Systems' downtown office, signing a contract that changed everything. The agreement was clear and firm. I was officially licensing my architecture to Axiom under exclusive terms, and along with it, I was stepping into a new role as their director of technology development. The signing bonus they offered was generous enough to make my hands shake slightly as I signed, a validation not just of my work, but of the years I had spent quietly holding Altura together while they underestimated me. The contract was structured perfectly. I would retain a percentage of royalties from future adaptations of the architecture, have real decision-making authority within Axiom's technical leadership, and for the first time in a long while, I would be working with people who actually valued innovation instead of just paying lip service to it. I walked out of that office with my head high and a future I had built myself, without compromising or begging anyone for recognition. Meanwhile, Altura Tech was spiraling even faster than I had expected. News broke late Tuesday evening that the Federal Trade Commission had launched a formal investigation into the company, focusing on multiple legal violations ranging from misuse of patented technology to investor fraud. Apparently, my legal notice had been just the first domino to fall. Altura's reckless internal practices, the same ones I had quietly endured for years, were finally catching up with them in the harshest way possible. I watched the headlines roll in from my new office at Axiom, the sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling none of the bitterness I thought I might. There was no anger left, only a clean, cutting satisfaction. I had done the work. I had taken the hits. And in the end, when the dust settled, I was the one still standing. On Wednesday morning, I decided it was time to add the final touch. I arranged for a professional courier to deliver an envelope directly to Ben Carter's office at Altura Tech. I could have sent an email or had my lawyer handle it, but some things are worth doing with a bit more ceremony. Inside the envelope was the formal, notarized notice that absolutely and irrevocably banned Altura Tech from using, modifying, or replicating any part of the patented server architecture. It spelled out the penalties for any further infringement in precise, painful detail, leaving no room for misinterpretation. But that was only half of what I sent. Tucked neatly behind the legal document was a printed copy of the termination letter Ben had handed me the previous Friday. The one where he, in his usual smug tone, had written that I was being dismissed for inefficiency and an inability to align with Altura's new vision for speed and innovation. I had highlighted that particular phrase in bright yellow, just to make sure he did not miss it. And beneath it, in sharp black ink, I had added a short handwritten note, signing it simply. Warmest regards, Olivia Hayes, Director of Technology Development, Axiom Systems. No threats, no insults, just a clear, silent reminder of exactly who had won. By the end of the week, the inevitable happened. News broke late Friday afternoon that Ben Carter had been fired by Altura Tech's board of directors, the official statement citing gross negligence and substantial damage to the company's operational and financial standing. I had expected it to happen, but even I was a little surprised at how quickly they turned on him once the full scope of the disaster became impossible to hide. There were no grand farewells, no carefully crafted press releases celebrating his visionary leadership. They pushed him out the door with all the ceremony of taking out the trash. By the time the internal memo leaked to the press, Altura stock had barely stopped bleeding, and half their major clients were either gone or actively shopping for new partners. The board had no choice. They needed a scapegoat, and Ben was standing exactly where they needed him to be. I watched it all unfold from my new office at Axiom Systems headquarters, a fresh cup of coffee in my hand, and the city skyline stretching out in front of me through wide, spotless windows. The headlines scrolled across my laptop screen one after another, each one a little more brutal than the last. Altura Tech House CEO amid scandal. Former executive faces legal fallout after patent dispute. Innovation conference disaster leaves Altura in freefall. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. There was no anger anymore, no bitterness. Just a clean, quiet sense of closure. They had underestimated me. They had dismissed me. And now they were paying the price. And me. I was exactly where I was meant to be, building something better, on my own terms, with people who knew better than to mistake calm professionalism for weakness. For me, it was never just about revenge. It was about a just and well-earned victory over a system that so often chews up the very people who quietly hold it together. The people who build, who fix, who innovate behind the scenes while others in polished suits slap their names on the results and smile for the cameras. Watching Altura Tech crumble under the weight of its own arrogance was satisfying, sure, but what mattered more was knowing that I had stood my ground. I had protected what I created, not just for my own pride, but because it deserved better than to be destroyed by carelessness and greed. I knew now, without a shred of doubt, that real power is not found in corner offices, designer suits, or hollow speeches about innovation. Real power is in knowledge. It is in understanding the systems you build so well that no one can take them from you without paying the price. It is in trusting your own worth, even when those above you try to diminish it. From my new office at Axiom Systems, I looked out over a future I had built with my own hands, surrounded by people who respected my work, not just the results it produced. It was a new beginning, one that I had earned not by playing their game, but by refusing to lose myself in it. Thank you all for reading this story.